Well, howdy guys and gals, welcome back to The Social Regressive. Today's video is probably going to be the longest one in the series. I was wrong about the magnification one. We have a lot to talk about today. There are a lot of little tests that you can perform when you're at your sporting goods store to check a scope and see if it's one that's going to work well for you, if it actually has everything running on the inside, and you can start to figure out its optical qualities, especially when you compare it to another one. Let's dive right into this. The first and most obvious things are going to be the mechanical controls. So what you can do with whatever scope you're trying to check out, like here, let's take a look at this very inexpensive Simmons 44 mag. This is a 6-24. They don't make this one anymore. They make some scopes that are actually quite a bit better now, even though this one is quite decent for its price tag, 100 bucks. This is a kind of a varmint setup, and what I can do to start off with is just check and make sure that everything feels very smooth and precise. My diopter adjustment here feels very good. I don't feel any hitches. There's no grit. It doesn't feel like there's anything hanging up in there. Okay, fine. I have my zoom ring. If I move it a little bit more quickly, I can feel a little bit of clunking in there. So the cam tube isn't perfectly sized for the cam in there, but if I move it at a slower pace, that's not bad. That works okay. And for 100 bucks, all right, that's fine. The turrets that we have up here, I want to feel what the click value is like, what its qualities are like. Okay, I'm getting just a tiny bit of sound. This one's very quiet. It seems to be hitting its spots very precisely, as far as I can tell from the outside. We can check on the inside here in a second. But this does seem to be snapping pretty neatly, and there really is not much wiggle at all once I get into one of these detents. That's actually sitting quite nicely. If you do have a lesser expensive varmint, especially one of these varmint scopes that has turrets that track up and down, here's something to keep an eye on. Look and see, first off, do you have graduations on the front of the turret face here? These can be really handy. I love these, especially if you're going to be taking really long shots. You want to be able to tell how many times you've spun around, and you can use those markings to tell how far your turret has tracked up and down. And if you have, again, with kind of an inexpensive one like this, if you have one of these turret knobs, make sure that it's actually going to continue to track properly with those graduations. If you have one that's been either cut wrong or installed wrong, you're going to watch it kind of do this against those graduations. It's not just going to track up or down. It might kind of do some waviness, and it's going to throw off your shots. You might think that you're at a certain adjustment on here, but it could actually be off. So look for that. If you see that, ignore that scope. You might look at another one in a different box, maybe the same model, and maybe that one will fix it. I've only run into that, I think, twice, but it can happen. This one feels good, though. It doesn't have quite the same quality as you're going to get from a scope like the Bushnell Forge right here. It does feel pretty positive, and I can feel it pop into its locations, but I can feel that the tension is different as I dial down versus dial up, and it's going to be very easy to accidentally skip over some of the detents on this one. It's going to be more difficult with this because of how snappy it is. And you can hear that from whatever microphone you're picking this up from right now. Oh, it's just wonderful. I love the way that the Forge works. And then if you do have some of the extra features, like if you have you can't test the zero stop really, but if you do have locking turrets, check those out. Make sure that it's all going to lock back in place, it's not going to play, and that it does pop back up neatly so that you can make your adjustments. This one does have a zero stop set on it, so I can go ahead and test that out. But yeah, in the store, you're not going to be able to. Some of the other mechanical things that you can test on here, we have the side parallax adjustment. This should also be nice and smooth. And this one should be relatively easy to spin. It kind of depends on what you're after. You may want a quick zoom ring. You may want a quick parallax adjustment if you're used to dealing with targets that vary by their distance, especially very quickly. You may want to be able to pop these very quickly over to one spot or another. This one has a pretty firm zoom ring and a pretty quick side parallax adjustment. And some of these kind of mix things around. This side parallax adjustment is very quick to get through, and the zoom ring on it is actually pretty quick as well. It's not too bad, and it has this little lever that's going to help out with that. So you might just check it and see how it feels, if it's something that's going to work for your situation. If you have other mechanical doodads, please check them out. You might have flip levers, you might have illumination. They're probably not going to have batteries in them, so you might not be able to test this one. But the illumination is an important one. If something's going to fail, it's probably going to be that. So if you can check it before you leave the store, go ahead. Now we're getting down to some of the more important stuff. We're going to start figuring out what the actual optical qualities of this are, and we're going to be able to test some of the mechanical functions as well. The first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out what the diopter adjustment is for our eyes. So I'm going to pick some kind of a blank wall somewhere in the store. Usually it's kind of light up there, it's white. I actually prefer something that's not very bright. I prefer something that is kind of a mid-gray. If I can find a blank spot like that, then I can begin to roll the adjustment on the eyepiece here until it hits the exact spot that I like, where everything is crisp and in focus. And this is one that's a little bit tough to find. We'll talk about how you might adjust this afterward just a little bit for your eye. But for the most part, this is something where you just look and see how it appears to you. Once you have your diopter set, we can start to figure everything else out on the inside here. We can start to figure out its optical qualities and some of its mechanical properties as well. So see if you can find a spot now to lay this out flat. If there's some kind of bench, a shelf, someplace where you can lay this and help to keep it from moving. If you can find maybe something to put against the sides of this to keep it from moving too much, it's going to allow us to do some of the tricks that we're going to do right here. The first thing that I want to do once I get everything in focus with the diopter is I'm going to pick an object at a kind of a close distance at the store. So whatever parallax adjustment that I might have, and some of these scopes won't have parallax adjustment at all. If you do, like a varmint scope like this one, I'm going to try to find something that's as close to that close focus as I can, just a little bit farther than it. So this will actually roll down to 10 yards. I'm going to try to find something at about 12 yards and get my parallax so that the focus is just right on that one spot. And to do that, I'm going to actually zoom in all the way first. So I'm going to get as close to the object as I can, roll parallax until it's perfectly in focus, and then I'm going to get my eye behind the scope, and without touching the scope, I'm going to move my head around and see how the reticle shifts against that target, whatever it is that I'm pointing at. That's about 12 yards away in this case. And some of these will have different parallax distances. Some can only go as close as 25 yards, 50. Find something in the store that's going to be about that far away. If you're in a Bass Pro, you got all the distance you want. But yeah, I'm going to find that thing and I'm going to move my head around. If the crosshair or whatever reticle that I have in there moves relative to the target, that means my parallax is off. It's not quite right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust parallax. I'm just going to tweak it little by little until as I move my head around behind the scope again, this time it stays locked onto the target. It's probably going to shift as I get to an extreme if I really get off to the side, and that's fine. But in general, if I'm looking more toward the center of the scope and I start to move around a little bit, that crosshair should stay locked right on the target. So that's my proper parallax. If it matches up with the focus, good. That's a good indication that things are going to go well for me in the future, especially if I'm at a close distance like that. At farther distances, it actually gets easier in a lot of cases. But if it has not matched up, I might try messing with the diopter adjustment just a little bit. I might have been off a tad on what I considered my real focus to be. There's quite a variety of distances at which I can get my diopter just right. There's actually a lot of flexibility in there. So maybe I can try again and it'll get that reticle in focus. If it doesn't, then that's probably not the scope for me. I need to start looking at something else. An inexpensive scope like this one might nail it. For example, this one does for me. But you might need to step up your price tag a little bit if you want to make sure that your parallax and your focus are as close as possible to each other. They're not always going to be the same, and one like this probably will be. It's not the end of the world if your parallax and your focus aren't exactly perfect. You might roll your focus and think everything is good and it's off by just a tiny little bit. you're going to find that quite a bit with some of the scopes that you see here on the bench. It's not always going to be exactly what you're after, and you might have to really tweak it in to get that perfect shot, especially for maybe target shooting. But for practical shooting, you're probably going to be pretty darn close. As you start stepping up in price, though, that's where those two should really start aligning more, and you shouldn't accept it if your focus is off and your parallax is quite a bit off. Don't deal with that. You might want to send that one back and try something else. As an example of that, I have this Bushnell Match Pro sitting on top of the telekinesis rifle, and this is one that has the best parallax adjustment / focus adjustment that I have used on any rifle scope yet. This one always locks right into the right spot, and I can lock this down extremely tight. So it makes sense. It's a target scope. If you are a varminter or a target shooter and you want to make absolutely sure that every bullet goes through the same hole, even if your head may be off just a tiny little bit, this is the scope to look at. It tracks perfectly on the turrets. Everything about this is really perfection, and its glass quality is right up there with the other elite tactical ones. That is really a scope to beat. The techniques that we just walked through, how to get your perfect focus and perfect parallax at the same time, that's something that you can use out in the field later. So once you actually buy your scope and get it out there, you might take a little time kind of tuning everything in, getting it all dialed in just right so you can make that quick and perfect shot. If you want to see more on this topic, check out Mark and Sam After Works channel, and in particular the video that I'm going to link you to here. You can see kind of a longer talk from Mark about how all this kind of stacks up, and you get an idea of what parallax really is. While we're still zoomed in, go ahead and roll focus back and forth on objects in the background and objects in the foreground and see if you can get everything crisply into focus. This is one that probably isn't going to fail very often, but you might as well check it. And don't worry if, as you dial your parallax adjustment, either out on an adjustable objective or here on the side or at the front of an SWFA, don't worry that it doesn't match up with the numbers that you see there. Maybe you have something that you're looking at in the store that's 10 yards away, but your parallax adjustment says that you're rolled to 15 and everything is perfect. Don't worry about it. This is not really a range estimator right here. It's just kind of an indication of roughly where things are going to be. While we're here, we can also take this time to check tracking. This is going to be a very difficult one. Don't be frustrated if this doesn't work out for you, because if I'm checking tracking on a scope, I usually have to have it locked down in something pretty tight. It needs to be in a machine rest, possibly locked down into a vise. That's how I usually check, or I need to shoot a box test. But if you can somehow kind of lock that scope down onto the shelf and keep it from moving, you might be able to figure out if it tracks correctly. And this really is a very big deal. All right, so if I can somehow clamp my hand down onto a scope, onto a shelf, say maybe that it has rings attached to it that I can kind of suspend it on and kind of push down on those instead of pushing down on the tube of the scope, I can grab my turret, and if I have a reticle that has maybe mil dots, mil hashes, MOA hashes, some kind of lines in there, then I can look and see where one of the lines or dots in my reticle is sitting on a target that's out there. So if I see a spot, like maybe it's a button on a shirt, okay, I have my 3 milliradian line on that. If I dial 3 milliradians on the turret in whichever direction I'm supposed to be going, then it should adjust that reticle until, say, maybe the crosshair is pointed at that button instead. So if you do get good tracking with that, and you can go ahead and test your side to side, your up and down, then you probably have a pretty good idea that you're onto a good scope. Some of these will not track true. Some of them really aren't designed to track at all. They're really supposed to just kind of get on zero and then you take a shot. And that's going to be really on the cheaper end of things. But as you get into something that you really need to rely on, something you're putting more money into, it had better track true. That's the mechanical. Now let's talk about optical, and I have a bunch of notes on this, some various things that we can figure out as we look through the scope, even in a store, to figure out how good the glass actually is in here and how it works. Now our goal overall is to just make whatever is far away from us to appear larger and to really just look like we're looking at it. We don't want it to look like we're looking through a whole bunch of lenses. That's my goal. I don't want it to seem like we're peering through some kind of ancient camera or, a crummy old telescope. We want this to feel like we just brought the things closer to us. So keep that in mind as you look at these things. And some of this is just going to be personal, how it actually appears to you. While we are still here at full zoom, go ahead, check that eye relief, see how far away you are from the scope. If you're going to have some kind of high recoiling magnum and your face is really, really close to that scope when everything is lined up just right, that might not be the scope for you. You might just want to check on that. Look for tunneling as you look at the image. You should see a very large image that fills the entirety of that ocular bell there. You should be able to see that image edge to edge once you have your head in the right spot. Not the case with all of these, and actually with some of these scopes that are really good, you're still going to get some tunneling. It just depends on how they have things set up. For example, here with the Horus Hover, this has a beautiful image to it, but this does actually exhibit some tunneling. I don't see the full image when I'm zoomed in at 20x here. It doesn't fill everything, and I'm going to see just a little bit of a black band all the way around. I'm kind of looking at the inside of the scope at the edges. Quite a few of the scopes that you see here on the bench are going to exhibit some kind of tunneling. You just don't want it to be excessive. It can get in the way of you really seeing your target for what it is, especially as you get this thicker black band around there. Try to eliminate that as much as possible. Light gathering is a tricky thing to figure out in a store, but thankfully most of them do have some kind of dim corners. So what you need to do is keeping your scope on its high zoom, keep both of your eyes open so you can kind of compare the image between the two and try to find someplace dim that's kind of in the shadows. You want to simulate dusk to your eye as much as possible. So look down into those shadows and see, number one, is it difficult to maybe keep your head behind the scope? Is it getting more difficult to look through there? And what kind of differences do you see between those two eyes? Do you start to lose some detail? Do you start to lose a little contrast when you are down in the darker areas? This one's going to be tough because I know a lot of these places are going to be lit up pretty well. But if you're in a Bass Pro Shop, they are not as well lit as a lot of these others. So you can actually find some dark areas to be peering around into. This might start to give you an indication. This one is tricky though. Resolution is another one that we have to test while we're at maximum zoom. If you dial all the way back, pretty much every scope that you pick up off the shelf is going to look great. When it's on its minimum zoom, everything's going to be beautiful. But to figure out the real limits of your scope, keep it zoomed in all the way and look for something that has some maybe high contrast areas for you to look at, something that has a pattern. If there is clothing that you can look at, you can see maybe threads, you can see little hairs hanging off, you can see the individual patterns inside the fabric, and you can start to figure out where it's falling off a little bit. Sometimes you might lose some of your details in your vertical lines. Sometimes you might lose details in your horizontal lines. And if you have diagonals, sometimes it'll lose those as well. It depends on the quality of the glass, it depends on how it's set up, and if it has an astigmatism going on. And to check that astigmatism, to make sure that we have resolution all the way edge to edge, don't just look through the center of your scope. Take it and move it off to the side, or look to objects off to the side that are in that same focal plane. And everything should still be as crisp at the edge as everything was in the center. With a less expensive scope, it is going to fall off at the edge. That's just part of the price trade-off. You're going to lose some detail. You're not going to be able to see all the little lines that you might have before. But if you can find a scope within your budget that can resolve those details out at the edge, then you have found yourself a winner. That's a good one to go to. And don't just look at the edge of the image itself. Take those turrets and dial them to one of the extremes. Go all the way to the top or the bottom or to the left or the right, and see how the image changes. In a lot of cases, you're going to start getting some vertical smear as you get to one of the extremes on the top end, or you get some horizontal smear as you go very far left and right. This is normal, this is going to happen a lot, but if you have a real gem of a scope, it's not going to fall off much, or it might not fall off at all as you get toward those edges. If you're an extreme long-range shooter especially, and you want to be able to very precisely hit a target at extreme distance, you want a scope that will continue to have that that good contrast and that good resolution, no matter how you're dialed on the scope. And again, that one's going to cost you some real money. Here are some of the inherent qualities that your glass might have. Look for sharpness. If you can see clearly defined borders between areas of color, then you're going to have a pretty sharp scope, and that's good. You want it to have a very clear delineation between things. And this can be caused by some of the astigmatism, some of the problems with focus, some of the problems with dispersion that'll start to break that up. But if you do see crisp lines between dividing areas, then that's probably a pretty good lens. Your contrast is going to be found by looking especially into some of the deeper, dimmer areas of the store. You can look around for differences in color even within those darker areas. You should be able to very clearly see color delineations between them. So if you, to your eye, you can see some differences in maybe two different tiles on the floor in the shadows, but through your scope, you start to lose that definition, then that lens isn't going to reproduce contrast quite as much, and you're probably going to lose the ability to see differences between maybe animal fur and leaves when you're out there. The higher you can get that contrast, the more you'll be able to kind of pick out little things. Look for color cast as you look through both eyes. You might have a scope that turns everything just a little bit more blue or a little bit more orange. Not the worst thing in the world. I've actually shot through some very fine scopes that cast things a little bit on the orange side, like the Bushnell HDMR2 had just a little bit of an orange cast to it, but it did such a good job of reproducing colors and sharpness and resolution and all that that I do not care that it makes everything just slightly orange. But if you get into one that is pretty extreme, you might actually be rolling off some of your colors and make it just a little bit more difficult to see things out in the real world, to be able to pick out that animal against the background. You guys probably remember from your high school physics class that if you pass white light through a material that is transparent but has a different density than air, then you're going to get some kind of refraction. It's going to split the light into its component colors. So you're going to get kind of that rainbow effect. Well, the same thing is going to happen inside your scopes. It's going to start to break the light apart. And you can test this just by grabbing a magnifying glass from your house and take a look at something under it. You're going to see some fringing as it actually kind of splits the image apart and turns it into its component colors just a little bit. Each of these scopes is going to have some kind of chromatic aberration like that. It's going to have that color distortion. There are going to be elements inside some of these that try to correct it, different types of glass, different lens types, but it's going to minimize that, and you do want it to be as little as possible. It might not be the most important thing relative to your scope, but if you want to see what your individual scope does, go ahead, take that scope while it's all nice and zoomed in, and point it at an area of very strong difference between light and dark. You need to have a light source. So look for a window. Windows are perfect if they're looking toward the outside. You have the inside of the store, you have the outside, and as you look at the border between them, as you look at the windowsill, you're going to see it start to split into different colors. You may see kind of a blue fringe on one side, on kind of the dark side. You may see some yellow poking out somewhere. And though the purchasers of very expensive scopes won't believe me, every scope exhibits some of this. Just some of them exhibit it less than others. Make sure that your eye is directly in the right spot behind the scope. You can use you can kind of back off to see some of the fringing around the outside to make sure you're in the center. And when you look through, especially in the center kind of crosshair area, you should see a pretty decent image. It shouldn't have a whole lot of chromatic distortion going on. As you get into less expensive scopes, you're going to see more. As you get into more expensive scopes, you're going to see less. And with all of these, as you start to really move your eye off axis to get it away from the center of that bell, you're not looking directly through the scope anymore, you're going to start to see it split more and more. If your color fringing is extreme, it's probably breaking down your image in other ways as well. There's probably going to be some softness in your resolution, and there might be some other issues going on. A lot of those are going to be tied together. So if you do see something extreme, maybe you can find one that exhibits less of that at your same price range. Now take your scope and point it at something kind of far away that's a perfect vertical or a perfect horizontal. You want this to be something that's very clean and straight. It could be a windowsill, it could be a stand that clothing is on. and then take the scope and point it off to the side just a little bit so that that object is off on the edge. You should still see the object straight up and down. If it starts to curve as it gets to the edge of the image, then that is going to be what we call barrel distortion. This is something that you shouldn't see much of at some of the longer distances. As you either get out of focus or as you get closer to things, you may start to see it more, and that is going to be normal in most cases. If you have an object at an extreme close distance, especially if it's out of focus, a lot of the time you will see a pretty bizarre distortion there. This scope, the Falcon S8i and the TS8X, these are ones that zoom all the way back out to 1x. These ones show a pretty decent amount of barrel distortion if you are at 1x at objects that are very close up. But when I'm zoomed in, I don't really see much barrel distortion with either of these. So if you are zoomed in with that scope, you shouldn't see much. One scope on my bench that does still show it, even at high zoom and at long off distances, is going to be the Bushnell AR Optics 4.5 to 18, but it really doesn't matter all that much. It does show some, but it doesn't really reduce my ability to take the shot that I need. This one is rather inexpensive, so it does have some of the other issues as well. It starts to drop off resolution as you get toward the edges, but considering its price point and how well it renders everything, I'm not really going to complain about this. This scope is actually quite good for the money. Photography fans in the audience know the word bokeh. It's apparently a Japanese word that means blur, and it refers to how a scope is going to render things that are out of focus. And we can use this bokeh to figure out how good certain elements of the scope are. What you need to do is stay zoomed in and find something in the room that has just a sharp little bloom of light. You could look toward the exit signs, and if they have one of those status lights on it that's always on, try to look at that and then get it out of focus. Or you can find a reflection. Maybe there's light coming in from the outside or a little pin light somewhere out there. Maybe there's a little spotlight shining on some stuff. Find a very small light that's relatively distant, or actually it can be kind of close too. But find this thing and get it out of focus. Try the near field, which is where it's going to be out of, you're actually focusing beyond it, and try the far field as well. And you're going to be able to see that bloom of light. It's going to go from a teeny tiny little dot when it's in focus, and it's going to grow into a circle that is kind of hanging out in the background of your image. If you have a very good scope, then you should have a similar brightness to that disc all the way from the center out to the edge. You shouldn't see it start to dip off and get a little bit darker and then suddenly have a bright ring around the edge. Most scopes actually will look like that. They'll be bright in the center, they'll start to fall off, and then you'll get a ring around the edge. The closer you can get to evenness with all of that, the more you have a very good scope, one that's going to look very clean and clear. And as you're seeing maybe other targets in your field of view, you're not going to be losing things about them. You're still going to be able to see them very clearly. This is also a chance to see if your scope has any scratches, artifacts, or dirt, because when you do roll this bokeh up, they're probably going to show up in that little disc if you have anything weird going on. And if you want to see something really cool, I think it's when you're in the near field. Yeah, when you're in the near field, when you've focused beyond that pinpoint light, you can start to see actually the grind that they put on the lens. You can see this kind of spiral on the inside. If you have a very tight spiral or you can't really see the spiral that well, that's a good indication that they put a good grind on it and it's going to be a little smoother than some of the others. If you get into some where you can really see the grind, doesn't mean it's a bad lens, but it does mean you're probably going to get a little bit of dispersion, maybe a little bit of a Fresnel effect coming through there. It might kind of move things around just a little bit. These are all qualities that we could test in a lab setting. These aren't really personal. And these are the sorts of things that your independent scope reviewers can tell you about and, kind of give you a pretty good idea of what you're going to be dealing with. But think about the personal stuff before you let go of this scope. Take it, point it around the room, see how easy it is to keep your head behind this, and really check out that reticle and see if it's going to accomplish what you're after. If you are heading out into terrain that has really high contrast, that has some difficulty with the background, you have a very mixed background that has a lot of stuff in it, make sure that that reticle is going to work out well for you. Some folks want that little bit of a thicker crosshair reticle. They want it simple. Some folks want data, and you might check to see if that data is getting lost as you're zoomed in and zoom out. Point it around the store, find different areas with different kinds of backgrounds, and see how it appears to you. That may help to steer you in a direction between two different scopes that otherwise have very similar qualities. Congratulations on making it through 15 videos. We're not done yet. We have some other discussions to get into, but really we have hit the core stuff. If this has been a help to you, please mention it down in the comments below. And if you think that this could be useful for somebody else, if only to get them to ask the right question about what they need for their rifle, please share this with folks. Grab this playlist and share it around. You might know some folks that need to start asking the right question instead of, what scope do I need for 308? Stay tuned and hit that notification bell because we are going to be talking about a few more topics that are kind of on the periphery of all this. We need to talk about spotting scopes, we need to talk about rings and mounts, and we have a couple other things to discuss that are going to help you be a bit more effective out at the range. And I'd also, once we get done with the whole series, I'd like to start talking about these individual rifle scopes, talking about how they fit into a budget and what kind of qualities they have and what sort of folks might like to use this in what situations. That's the most important thing to me. Purpose is the big deal. I'm not just going to talk about a scope as being good. What is it actually good for? We're going to figure out in those reviews. Big thanks to patrons of the Destructive Arts for helping me to produce this series and some of the other tests that we're doing around here. They're keeping the lights on, cameras, gunpowder and bullets, when that stuff actually comes back available. But thank you guys very much. We have at the 338 Lapua Magnum level, we have Sportsman's Guide, Stan and Mary, and Tyler. And at the 300 Win Mag level, we have Joseph Davis, Peter, Howard, and Mr. No Name, and a lot of other guys pitching in $1 or $2 a month. If you'd like to join them, I'll put a link to Patreon, and I'll see you all around. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. Even if you didn't like this particular content, go ahead and subscribe. There's probably something coming that's more up your alley. Check out this playlist right here. This is going to have videos in a similar vein to what you just watched. These two videos we cherry-picked for you. And finally, The Social Regressive is on Patreon. So you can become a patron of the Destructive Arts and earn some goodies while helping us to provide high-quality videos just by kicking us a few bucks a month. Thanks a bunch for your patronage.